for this address, keynote address by Alexander von Rospatt. My name is Kanak Mani Dixit, your moderator for this session. We'll have a presentation by Professor von Rospatt, and then Q&A. Perhaps his presentation will be about 45 minutes. Then we'll go in for 22 minutes to half an hour of question answer, because this is a full house of interested participants, including those who are experts in the field of Kathmandu Valley heritage, and students from and scholars from a variety of fields. So welcome to you all on behalf of the organizers, the Baha. Alexander and I both agreed that we would start today's proceedings with a tribute to Professor Dina Bangdel, who is no more with us, as some of you may know, and for some of you it may come as a bit of a shock, for which I apologize. But Dina left us a day ago. She was also a dear friend of both of us here in the panel, but more importantly than that, she is somebody who would have reveled in this session, to be able to see these murals, to know of what happened with the earthquake, to know of what plans Professor von Rospatt has to suggest for Santipur. So deep condolences on behalf of this gathering to the family of Dina Bangdel and to the family of scholars that she called her own. And the only thing that we can do is to commit ourselves to the kind of world-class scholarship that Nepal is not blessed with in the modern era as much as we should be, but a flame that she kept burning in the arena of Nepali Buddhistic and Himalayan art and art curation. And the many plans that she had, which we will have to keep alive, one of which is to ensure that Nepali youngsters get attracted to this arena of art and art curation and understanding ancient to modern Nepali art. The other is ultimately the ultimate return of stolen statuary from pedestals, nooks and crannies and temples and Bahas and Bahis of Kathmandu Valley and outside of Kathmandu Valley. And lastly, a grand exhibition that she felt was necessary to bring Nepal to the fore to the eyes of the world by bringing Nepali art to the Musée Guimet in Paris, to museums in Austria, Singapore, and the North America and Japan in a tour de force that would present ourselves as a country arisen after difficult times. That was her plan. So with those words in her memory, in something that is all too fresh for all of us here and makes us all a bit emotional, let us now move to the very important and invigorating presentation that we are about to get by Professor von Rospatt. His field is, of course, his current position is that of Professor of Buddhistic and South Asian Studies at University of California, Berkeley. And his field is the doctrinal history of Indian and Nepali Buddhism. But he is more than anything else for us, Nepali Join from Baha. That makes him all the most intimate for us. And his PhD was in Buddhistic philosophy, which encompassed the larger world of philosophy. And his initial assignment was to the Nepal Research Center, but he couldn't go there because after the unification of Germany, Alexander was, you can see I go from Professor von Rospatt to Alexander because I yet do not know when to regard him as friend and when to regard him as the great scholar that he is. So forgive me for jumping onto both sides. But the Nepal Research Center was where he was supposed to have gone. But then the unification of Germany meant that he was redirected to Leipzig. And it was later that the great Professor Kolver, who has been instrumental in the setting up of the Nepali Manuscripts Project, which is essentially the heart of the museum, the Nepal archives, the National Archives. He brought him to Nepal and slowly, as Professor Rospatt says, gently pushed him into the direction of studying Svayambhu, because Professor Kolver also did study Svayambhu. More than that, I do not want to refer to, because everything will be in the presentation. I might just, while perusing the papers written by Professor von Rospatt, let me make just 2 points. One is his suggestion, based on his deep study, that the Svayambhupurana, on which these murals are based, was an attempt to centering Buddhism in the Nepal Mandala, in Kathmandu Valley, after Buddhism went into eclipse in the plains. That is an interesting suggestion from him as to the origins of the Svayambhupurana. The other point that I find intriguing and interesting is that Svayambhu itself was a reference not to the Chaitya, but perhaps to what he calls the primordial rock that would have been at the base of that, at the top of the hill, that was the Svayambhu hill, and that on which was placed the Chaitya. So this primordial rock was the one that would have been self-originated, or Svayambhu, which then got covered up with the Chaitya and what we call Svayambhu hill, which is not called that by the Newar inhabitants of Kathmandu Valley. I will not go more into that, other than now to suggest that Professor von Rospatt, we've got a great audience, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Now? Yeah, great. Thank you, Kanakji, for your introduction. Thank you very much for coming. And let me add my words about the terrible shock and sadness that I feel about the loss of Dina. She stayed more than once with us in Berkeley. I lived for a year in her house, and we've been very close friends. And we have shared the passion for the arts and culture and religion that, of course, she was born into and that I, in a sense, married into. And we've done a lot of work together, actually. The murals that I'm showing you to, we more than once went together and saw them together. And indeed, she was way too young, way too precious for her family and for us to be gone. Sorry. Tough one. So what I want to talk and share with you is not my work on the renovations, on the history of Svayambhu, something I've worked on for many years, but I want to talk more specifically about the paintings that depict the mythological history of the Svayambhu, Chaitya, and the whole Nepal Valley in the antechamber, the vestibule of the shrine of Santipur. So this is, of course, Svayambhu, as you know well, and most of you will be aware that the temple of Santipur is here at the site. It's a Tantric temple, and the inner precincts of the temple are closed to anybody but the Takali, the eldest of the community of Buddhacharyas, and to the Purohit, to the priest of Makan Bahal, who is in charge of the rituals. So there's only 2 people allowed to go inside. But the space before the door, this is an historic drawing of the same Santipur temple. The space before here, before these doors, which many of you know, is open to the public. And indeed, traditionally, particularly during the months of Gunla, which has just started, the faithful come and they offer a dhup and bati in front of the door, and then they move on to the many other shrines that surround the stupa. So this is public space, the antechamber, And I must admit, I've been there many times, and I wasn't even aware that the walls were painted with these magnificent murals. It took me some years until it dawned upon me, because the space is dark, and also the murals tend to be covered by the soot from the offerings. So I was aware of it when I ventured into this on my regular visits to Svayambhu in 2003, and it turned out they'd just been cleaned, and for once newly I saw them in their full glory, and I immediately phoned my friend Niels Gutscho and said, we've got to take pictures of this. And we were fortunate that Niels' photographer Stanislav Klimek was in town, and Niels sent Stanislav to work with me, and we were very fortunate that the Buddhacharyas living up at Svayambhu have always treated me with great generosity and respect, and they immediately said, sure enough, we're going to close the doors and it's all yours. Brought in letters and other support, and so for 2 days, with the help of the Buddhacharyas, we took a full documentation of what was left. And to, in a sense, jump ahead to the end of my talk, it is this documentation, this photo documentation by Stanislav Klimek, that will actually allow us to do what I hope will happen, namely to recreate these mural paintings once Santipur has been rebuilt. To say that ahead of time, almost all of the murals fell off during the earthquake. What remained was rescued and is in Chauni Museum. I have started working on these murals with the help of the photography and with the help of my teacher and mentor, Kashinath Tamod. We've been working and with a lot of painstaking effort deciphered what could be deciphered of the captions that accompany these murals. This is a really important place within the larger kind of sacred topography of Newar Buddhism. You can see that annually it is being repainted. This is just happening here at this moment, when also the eyes and other features of the stupa are being repainted. This is a traditional Chitraka in charge of this. And also what is interesting, I'll talk about this later, but since I have this photo, I like to kind of point this out. The two flanking images here go together with the door, and actually this is kind of the equivalent of what you normally find in a Nepalese Buddhist in a Newar Agon. It's a curtain, simulates a curtain. It separates the inner precincts where only the Takali and the Guruju goes, the principal main Purohit Guruju, and the space where the other initiates can be. So the mural paintings that are above, start above the door here. So this is the door that I've just shown you, and they're here on the northern front, and then they, this is the door again. You see the Purana, you see Chepu here, so it kind of painted partly Purana that you have here. You've got the presiding figure of Vajradhara and two Siddha figures. And then you have the registers that actually relate the story of the Svayambhupurana. Another image of the same northern wall to give you a sense of kind of how this works. Basically, it goes like this, and then eventually it picks up on the northern wall, on the next wall, the eastern wall, then it wraps around on the southern wall, then it wraps around on the western wall, and it continues like this. So actually, the mural is painted almost as if somebody had unwound a gigantic, let me get the number right, almost 180 meter long scroll across this space. So this is, it mimics clearly as inspired by these horizontal narrative paintings that the Newar tradition has. But it has been, painted onto the walls, and in that sense, of course, differs from these scrolls, which are always brought out particularly during Gumla, for display, but normally kept in storage. I've tried to collect and lay my hands on other pictorial depictions of the Svayambhupurana. This is, more than 10 or 20 times as large than anything else that exists. It's the largest painting not only of the Svayambhupurana, but I'm convinced of any Buddhist narrative theme. And I actually suspect that there's no other narrative, Buddhist or Hindu, that has been painted in the Nepalese tradition. So it is very, in that sense, it's really big. The version that is depicted here, let me show you just a few more slides to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So these are the different registers. This is about a foot tall, and then you've got the caption here. And one thing you can see already here, when you're at the when you're standing at the bottom, of course it's very difficult to make this out. And then in addition, the fact that there isn't proper light in the antechamber, and also that people keep on offering duper and deeper, and there's soot building up, it's clear that they're normally actually not seen. And it raises questions about whether that was factored in, whether it was when it was originally painted, whether that actually mattered. And it connects to this whole kind of discourse of when sacred art is made, is it actually made for the human eye or not? But that's a different story than what I want to talk about. So this is kind of what these look like. I will show you a few more in detail. And this is how the narrative wraps around. So this is the northern wall, and this is the eastern wall. And it first wraps around on this level, then it wraps around here and here. In the manner of a painted scroll. This is a painted scroll from Baha, actually a copy of the original that is lost, but that is displayed during Gumla, so it's the same kind of object that is here being depicted on the wall. This I think I owe to you, David, if I remember correctly. So this is the eastern wall, and I'll show you that again later, but to just show this to you ahead of time, this is the very end of the whole Svayambhupurana depiction, and it actually depicts a family from Kohiti here in Kathmandu, a Chitrakar family who was in charge of the last renovation. So the last renovation of these paintings was done in 1904, and that actually means that most of these paintings are not terribly old. We also know this because the townscapes include things like the Bhimsen Tower and other Rana objects that are obviously 19th century, not earlier. However, as I will argue later, I believe that the origins of these murals go back to Pratap Malla, so that they're basically 350 years old. But they've been repainted over and over, I believe quite faithfully. But my gut feeling is that the latest 1905 iteration of repainting them wasn't done in the most artistic manner, so I suspect that the original paintings were actually of a higher aesthetic quality. So it wraps around here, as I said. This is the eastern wall, and this is actually wrapping onto the southern wall, and this is the western wall. And on the western wall, actually, there's only really one scene that survived. This scene here, where one Naga, one serpent deity, Kakotaka, is being forced by the king Gunakamadeva to come to Santipur for rain-making rituals. So actually, one wall, it's the least elaborate, the smallest space. The western wall has actually been lost before the earthquake. And if we actually will recreate, if there will be a recreation of the murals, an interesting decision will have to be made what to do with that space. I don't know, David, did I learn from you that the Chitrakars actually have a complete painting of everything? somewhere, I forget, I must admit the source, but somewhere there is the Kimvadanti, and maybe it's more than Kimvadanti, that the original Chitrakar renovators from 1904 keep in their possession a complete drawing of all of the paintings. If that were true, it would of course be very easy to recreate this particular wall. So let me go a little bit into detail. So I showed you the end with the colophon, with the donors. The beginning is here. This is the start of the painting, and you see the outermost of several complex nested frames. So the story of the Svayambhupurana is being reiterated over and over again. And this starts with these two characters, with Jayashri and Jineshwari, one the king, one the bodhisattva. It continues with Ashoka, whom you can see here staying in his own place, Tawadesa. So this is actually Ashoka at Pataliputra here. And Ashoka is talking to his preceptor, his principal mentor, Upagupta. And then Upagupta relates to Ashoka how once upon a time our Buddha, Shakya Singha Buddha, Shakya Muni Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, how he once upon a time was telling people about the most important Buddhist practice there is. He was giving a sermon in India talking about the so-called bodhicitta vrata, that is taking the aspiration of becoming a Buddha, the ritual in Mahayana Buddhism, the foundational ritual of becoming a bodhisattva. And the Buddha is then being asked, this is all wonderful, let's do it, by the devotees. And the Buddha says, well, yes, if you really want to do it, we should do it at the best possible place to do so. And they ask, where is the best possible place? And he says, it's Svayambhu in Nepal. And then all of them leave India and they head towards Svayambhu because this is the most powerful and best place for this particular practice. This actually goes into something that Kanakji mentioned already. Part of what the Svayambhupurana accomplishes is that it centers the focus, the gravity of Buddhism in the Kathmandu Valley. Kathmandu is no longer peripheral to India, but actually it's the other way around. Shakyamuni is in India, and he acknowledged to his disciples that the true center is actually Nepal, and that's where they're all going. This is then Buddha appearing at Svayambhu already, and he's telling the people about the history of Svayambhu. And that is essentially the story of the mythical origination that I'll talk you a little bit more about. And in the process, he's actually his interlocutor, the person he talks to, is Maitreya Bodhisattva, the future Buddha. So one of the things that the Svayambhupurana does, it actually invokes past Buddhas, the present Buddha, our Shakyamuni, and the future Buddha, Maitreya, is kind of attesting to the veracity of the story. And this is actually the earliest of the past Buddhas, Vipashri, he is called here, normally known as Vipashyin or Vipashvin in the Nepalese tradition. And he is here talking about Svayambhu already. Actually, the main story, the Kathmandu Valley once upon a time was a lake. Upon the lake, on a lotus flower, the Buddha principle manifested in the form of light, Jyoti Rupa, upon a lotus flower. And this is Svayambhu, self-manifested. And then later Manjushri came and drained the lake and started human civilization and so on. The main storyline is related over and over again. So Vipashvin actually teaches it as a prophecy because he predates these events. And just to give you a few of these principal scenes, this is how the Kathmandu Valley looked before it was the site of the manifestation of Svayambhu. So it's a tirtha where people come for snana, and it's waterborne creatures and it's divine beings and nagas who come here to do a snana, to take a sacred dip. This is the moment that the Jyoti Rupa, the light, manifests. Here in the imagination of the painter, it already assumes the form of a stupa. The text is quite clear that originally it's just a light. And actually the physical structure, the stupa, is only built and erected in the penultimate chapter of the Svayambhupurana at a time when the Kali Yuga dawns, and there is a perception that this glorious manifestation could be defiled by humans who are corrupted and wicked. And so the point of this building is really to encase and enshrine and protect the Buddha principle. This is the moment when Manjushri, in the form of Manjudeva with his two consorts, comes to the Nepal valley. He is seen in vision while possibly on Wutaishan in Mahachin. He's seen in his vision this glorious light and came, and here with his sword cuts a gorge at the southern ring of the valley, popping and so on, in order to drain the valley of the water. And assisted by his two consorts in the process. You can also see, this is, not, I can't draw and paint, and I shouldn't say this, but obviously it's not the greatest piece of art. So, to kind of run ahead to the conclusion, so if this indeed will be repainted, I don't think this scene survives. It wouldn't make an awful lot of sense to me to repaint it in this precise way in which it was painted in 1904. I'm sure that the wonderful artists we have in our present day, Kathmandu, could do much, much better than that, and why not improve upon it rather than recreate it? But that's, I'm running ahead of time. That's really for the end. I just wanted to draw your attention. And maybe this other piece of Kimbvadanti about the Chitrakar family, that's a little bit nasty and maybe it's not true. But the story that, I can't remember, it wasn't you, David, who told me that? I just wonder who told me the story. It was you, Hubert, yeah? Okay, thank you. So it was Hubert de Clare who's sitting there, to whom I owe this. So the other story was that supposedly some of the wives of the Chitrakars lent a helping hand when they were short of labor, and that they weren't the greatest and the best trained artists when they did this. In other words, one more argument, one that doesn't necessarily have to recreate this faithfully. This is the draining of the lake one more time. Here is the crucial story that the Nagas were flushed out in the process, and that the Nagas were very unhappy about this, and that afterwards the Nagas were kind of invited back in to take up abode in this lake close to Paping that is still there and sometimes known as Danadaha, as you can see here. The other crucial element of the core myth is that when Manjushri drained the valley, there was one spot where water kept on welling up and in a sense defeating his attempt of creating dry inhabitable land, namely at Guhyeshwari, and he followed basically the stalk of the lotus flower, and there he found the goddess Guhyeshwari, and with his samadhi power managed to stop water welling up and to complete his project of draining the valley. So this is a drawing, a painting of Svayambhupurana that has been published quite a long time ago by Mary Slusser, the famed author of Nepal Mandala. And this is kept, this fragment, and its only fragment is kept in the Cleveland Museum where Mary Slusser used to be curator. By my reckoning, this is the fragment only covers about a fifth, so 4/5 of this fragment are lost. But the interesting thing of it dates to the time of Pratap Malla, and it may very well that it resembles or in some way or another was in relationship to the murals that were painted at Santipur. Speculative, of course. This is a scene, the same scene that I showed you before, King Gunakarmadeva taming Karkotaka Naga, who refused initially to come for the rainmaking ceremony, and bringing him by force to Svayambhu. This is an interesting other detail. This is actually the preaching scene where the entire narrative material is embedded and signaled to be part of a sermon that Shakyamuni delivered on that occasion. So the narrative frames are preserved here, and one thing that's really remarkable about the Svayambhu mural that I showed you, it actually preserves each and every of these narrative frames. It's actually a very faithful pictorial rendition of the middle-length version of the Svayambhupurana. The Svayambhupurana, the origins might be at the time of Jayasthitimala or a little bit later. So it dates back, let's say, to the beginning of the 15th century, around 1400 or so. But it kept on growing as a narrative. And a full and complete study of this network of related text hasn't been done. But basically, I think we can distinguish 4 different versions. A really short version, which survives in palm leaf manuscript here in the National Archives. A middle-length version, a longer version called Brihad, and then a version called Mahapurana. And to say this ahead of time, we can actually date, by looking at the murals, we can kind of relate it to these versions. It is later than the shortest version, and it is older than the longest, the Mahapurana version. Just to show you, I mean, most of you have seen this, of course, and you can actually see it next Purnima. This is the way traditionally such paintings are displayed in Bahals and Bahis for people to kind of get a visual relation of these stories. And this is something nice and interesting I wanted to share with you. So this is something that I've only had the good fortune to learn of about a year ago. This is the last and final scene of this pauba that is survived or reached, or I don't know how, that is kept in the Virginia Museum in the United States. And it's a really wonderful depiction of the Svayambhupurana, almost unharmed. There's a little bit of a problem in reading the date, but it's definitely second half of the 19th century. So it's not terribly old, but preserved very well. And it has, intriguingly, the very last scene. So it's the scene that is here. The very last scene actually depicts the original consecration and dedication of the painting. Which is here, and here it wraps around. So actually the painting shows how it itself, the painting itself, typical for self-reverential things you have in Buddhist literature, how it's being installed and consecrated at this time. It also shows that at the same time a written version of the Svayambhupurana, a pustak, was dedicated at the same time. This was, the main priest was the great-grandson or great-great-grandson of Amritananda, the principal collaborator of Brian Hodgson, Horton Hodgson. And so it's definitely from Patan. And I don't know, Manikji or other people, it doesn't actually identify the Bahal. This is obviously a rectangular Bahal. This is just this one wall that allows us to peek in. There's a kind of Ashoka stupa in the center. And there are these 2 different distinct doors to shrines. So if any of you knows what Bahal this could be, I'd be really, really interested. Of course, chances is it doesn't look like it nowadays. And maybe I should seek out Satyaman Joshi or somebody like this to find out. So just a few points about this particular painting. Actually, the main point is the following. This painting is younger than the Svayambhupurana in Santipur. We know this from the date, but also the whole depiction differs. Actually, only up to here you have Svayambhupurana. Then you have almost a third of the painting is the legend of Manichuda, the so-called Manichuda Avadana, the story about the Bodhisattva king who had a crest jewel seated in his skull, which he donated, and a story that is identified with Sanku and the mountains above Sanku, and that's of course why it found its way into the Svayambhupurana, which in a sense started to look beyond Svayambhu and take stories about other sites, legends about other sites on board. And it obviously, the main narrative that really almost eclipses the Svayambhupurana is the Manichuda Avadana. So that is 1/3. And then 1 more third are similar legends, Mahatmya-style legend, about the so-called 8 Vitaragas, 8 sacred places, and the 12 tirthas, 12 sacred water places. So the 8 Vitaragas and the Dwadasha Mahatmyas, they actually first, I believe, exist on their own as separate Mahatmyas. And by the time of the largest of the Svayambhupurana versions, the so-called Mahapurana, they were incorporated into that version. And interestingly, that version has been translated numerous times into Nevari. And that version is kind of popularly circulated. For instance, the late Badriratna Vajracharya has a Nevar version, which he later translated into Nepali, that faithfully follows this Mahapurana version. So this painting also reflects precisely that version. Only a third is Svayambhupurana without the Ashtavitaragas and the Dwadasha Mahatirthas. The rest is 1/3 Mahanichuda Vadana and 1/3 these other tirthas and Vitaraga sacred places. Just to show you a few places of this is a really magnificent painting. You have Ganesha at the beginning, and then here at first scene you again have Jayashri and Jineshwari conversing, and it's actually that the monk here tells that once upon a time Ashoka and Upagupta meet, and that is here. And then Upagupta tells Ashoka, once upon a time there was Shakyamuni. And then actually it shows here how Shakyamuni, together with all of his people, goes to Svayambhu, depicted here, in order to, together with all of his followers, make them take the Bodhisattva vow. And interestingly, this is a topic of a small book that Gudrun Bünnemann just published in Lumbini. Interestingly, the Buddha rides on a naga. That normally is associated with Lumbini, but in these paintings, I show you another one, it also happens. These are more scenes. Here you can see the arising of the lotus, the Jyoti Rupa, and actually Vipashwin casting a seed into the lake, and in that sense planting that manifestation. Here you see the draining mist, you see the naga that is being dislodged, and you see how Manjudeva, Manjushri is following the origins of the stalk of the lotus flower and ending up at the Guhyeshwari place that is being worshipped thereafterwards. This is from the end of the scroll. So I'm not showing you actually the Manichuda Vadana and the Ashtavitaraga and Dwadasha Mahatirtha, Tirtha Mahatmya, but I'm showing you the core Svayambhupurana. So this is the end, and this is actually a king called Prachanda Deva, who is associated with Gauda, Bengal, Orissa, and who comes to Svayambhu because he has the aspiration to cover the light in the stupa that he's building here. And in order to do so, he first has to become a bhikshu, And then after having become a bhikshu, he also has to take the acharya abhisheka. He has to become a vajracharya, because that alone allows him to actually build and consecrate a stupa. And this is the building that he builds here, and it obviously reflects how Svayambhu looked in the second half of the 19th century. At the very end of the scroll, before this colophon scene that I showed you before, you have this famous scene of making the rains, Shantikaracharya making the Naga mandalas, and Kakotara Naga being brought by the king Gunakama Deva because it was so ugly that he didn't want to come of his own accord. So this is kind of the last scene, in some versions actually a prophecy rather than past events, and hence not associated with a Buddha. All the other events are attached to previous Buddhas, and in this way you've got the past Buddhas also in a sense vouching for the truth of the story, and all of them, the past Buddhas, the present Buddha, and the future Buddhas, all attesting and reiterating that Nepal is a sacred place in its own right. It's the center of Buddhism, it's where the Buddha principle manifested, in India's periphery. And this is again the colophon scene shown. And this is another painting that was actually painted for Hodgson himself, and that ended up, as many of the artifacts owned by Hodgson in Paris. And because it ended up in Paris, it was actually studied quite well, first by a French scholar called Fouché, and then by Sylvain Lévy, who is of course very famous for his 3-volume Le Nepal study, and later by Siegfried Lienhardt in a monograph dedicated to this. Actually, all of them didn't really appreciate that this is a very good and faithful rendering of the Svayambhupurana, but it does exactly the same as the scroll from Virginia does. Only a third is Svayambhupurana per se, another third is Manichudavadana, and another third is these sacred places, the so-called Vita Raga places and the Tirtha places. So this actually follows very much the same scheme as the Virginia scroll. And in truth, I should have put it the other way around, because this is a little bit older than the Virginia scroll. But both of these scrolls follow the Maha Purana and not the earlier versions. And Lienhardt actually stopped somewhere around here, so his publication doesn't even cover half. But the half that he covered is very nicely presented, and it's certainly worthwhile an effort, but the remaining 60% call for being published as well. These are a few scenes from it. Again, Ganesha at the beginning, it's very similar to the Virginia scroll. And again, you start having Jayashri and Jineshwari talking to each other. Okay, I should make sure that I don't run, but I've already run out of time, but never mind. More scenes to be looked at another time. I want to return briefly to this. This is important, Kanakji, so please allow me. I've only talked about the Svayambhupurana murals so far, but above it, you've got these paintings. This is on the north side, and I've shown this to you before, and this is on the south side. This is... Oh, I've got 15 minutes. Okay, great. Oh, that's great. I thought it was more like 5 minutes. Okay, in that case, I go back to my other slides. I won't. So this is the presiding deity over this, over the mural paintings. It's normally identified as Padmanreteshwar, and Hubert, your question of who exactly Padmanreteshwar is, I'm not really able to answer that. I searched for the name. That name does feature in the Nama Sangiti as a deity, but it's not the ordinary Lokeshwaras. And of course, one way one could think about that, this is obviously kind of the Buddhist equivalent of Nataraj. And once you equate Shiva and a Buddhist deity, you kind of normally end up with Lokeshwaras. But, that's not good enough. Really, he's the presiding deity here, because this is the area where Tantric dances are performed. Charya Nritya is performed. Dior Piekon is performed. And the people performing, enacting, staging these dances, not staged, enacting these dances, they're initiated in the cult of Nasadyor, to use the Newa word, or in a Buddhist context, Padmanateshwar, or in a Hindu context, you would probably say Nataraj. So he is the presiding deity because this is a place of practice, of initiatory sacred practice. So the chamber before the door, the antechamber, in an ordinary agam, in an ordinary tantric shrine, is reserved for people who are part of that kind of lineage, who have diksha, abhisheka, and who are part of this place and who practice there. They don't go behind the door because that's only for the takali and one priest. So that's off limits for just about everybody. But the space before the curtain or before the door is initiatory practice place. And so the deities above the Svayambhupurana narrative, they are deities associated with these practices. Padmanateshwar, Nyasadyor, and you've got these deity here. They're kind of guardian deities, the crow-faced and the owl-faced deity on the other side here. And you've got forms of Nayatmya and Vajrayogini who are being depicted here. So this is really initiatory yogini tantra practices as it's still practiced nowadays in agans of Vajracharya and also Shakya Bahals. And on the other side, you have these forms, Vajradhara, also tantric deity, and the Siddhas, of course, also speaking to tantric practice. So in a sense, the antechamber has two different themes, and it evokes two different narratives or forms of religious practice. The Svayambhupurana is an exoteric text for devotees, for the larger population, not in any way contingent upon being initiated. The other paintings above are. And traditionally, this happened until the earthquake, when you have a ritual at Svayambhu that has to be concluded by Mamaki worship or some other kind of higher tantric worship, the priests and the Buddhacharya judgments retire into this antechamber, the door is closed, and then they sing tantric songs and they do the tantric rituals that are not public. So that's how it's been traditionally used. I don't know how this happened, that part of this chamber was given to the Svayambhupurana mural. My suspicion is that it was Pratap Malla who did it. And I believe that it was Pratap Malla because he did a lot of things at Svayambhu. He did Pratapapur and Anantatupur, the two Shikara temples. He did the Dharmadhatu mandala in front. And here inside Santipur, he set up a stone in which he, there's a verse called Vrishdimani Stotra, in which he celebrates and commemorates his own incursion into this sacred place. Nobody is allowed to go. And in addition to this stone, he had this map drawn. Actually, the text here is taken from the inscription, and it describes how at that time there was a drought. They had to bring out the Naga rain mandala in order to make it rain. And the Takali of the Buddhacharyas and the priests from Makan Bahal were not able to. They were too scared to go into the deepest precincts of the temple. And according to the story, Pratap Malla said, I do it. Normally not meant to do it, but in this case, of course, he did it for the larger good, so it was okay. And he went inside, and he was communing with Shantikaracharya, this kind of mythical Naga tamer who still believed to stay there. This is a close-up of Pratap Malla. So my own theory is that actually Pratap Malla, in a sense, his whole story, which I consider to be mythological rather than factual history, is really very much as if it were a sequel to the Svayambhupurana, the final chapter, opening up with Pratap Malla as the main hero. In the earlier version, you've got Shantikaracharya as the priest, and Gunakamadeva as the king. Pratap Malla was not modest, so Pratap Malla actually assumes kind of both mantles, both that of a powerful tantrika and that of the king. And I find it imaginable, given all of the other stuff he did about Svayambhu, that he actually had the Svayambhupurana painted there in situ, the site of the action. And of course, it allowed him, in a sense, to write himself into the Svayambhupurana. So it's a form of appropriation. So, of course, also a way for a Hindu king to very much step into Buddhist terrain. There is supposedly a Tyasapu in the possession of one of the Buddhacharyas' family that Hemraj Shakya saw and consulted and reproduced in translation, Lewa translation, or maybe it wasn't even translation, in a rendering in his Mahachaitya book, the principal study that we have of Svayambhu. And that actually does ascribe the whole creation to Pratap. So there's at least some evidence that this is not purely fictional, what I'm just saying. But this single Tyasapu that I haven't seen on its own, I wouldn't put as much trust into it if it weren't for the fact that it's a very plausible scenario given the other pieces of evidence we have. We do have evidence of Tibetan pilgrimages in the 18th century, and they talk about these paintings as of old. So in the 18th century they were old already. That tells us that they, were there already for a couple of hundred years, and in a sense corroborates the Pratap version that I gave you. But of course, to return to the point, these are the donors, the Chitrakar family from Kohiti in 1904. The donor colophon here basically said that they filled in the blanks and repainted where necessary. So that's essentially was their project. But it wasn't clearly not a complete new creation. And actually there's a story that sometimes in the 1960s, Christian somewhat, there was also repainting being done up at Svayambhu. This is a close-up of the donative scene with the priest heading the principal donors. It was actually done in their name by their eldest son. This is the rest of the family. And this is obviously fast forwarding to 2 years ago. And, I wanted to talk in conclusion about what I think would be, about the need to pay attention to these murals, to do something for them. And, I'll take the liberty to suggest what might be one way of doing this. So remarkable is the scale of destruction up at Svayambhu, as you're surely aware of, was quite horrific. The only thing that is largely unharmed is the stupa. And this may have to do with the fact that from 2008 to 2010, the Nyingma Institute from Berkeley, led by Tsering Gelek, did a very careful job in repairing the surface of the stupa. Basically, they re-gilded all of the copper parts, but they took off the copper parts and they repaired all of the wooden parts. So they did a lot to enhance the structure of the building. And then also the stupa itself is constructed in a great way for earthquakes. The central pillar, the so-called life tree seated inside the tree, the Yoshi Yashti, doesn't actually touch any of the rings. So there is a lot of play. In other words, the structure can sway to and fro without actually breaking. That's, of course, what you want in an the buildings around were less fortunate, as we know. Both Pratapapur and Anantapur, the two buildings that Pratap Mala is responsible for, were destroyed. The two gompas are completely gone. Most of the houses of the Buddhacharyas are completely destroyed and cannot be inhabited and have to be dismantled. This is gone already. This is the Burmese gompa. And this is Shantipur. So Shantipur is interesting because they actually renovated it before the earthquake. But unfortunately, it wasn't done with the kind of earthquake savviness that ideally would have informed their efforts. So the building is really, really, it's still standing, but you can see here these huge holes under the gabled roof on both sides, actually. And, the destruction is enormous. The building is, it's basically being rebuilt without, rather than tearing it down, it is being rebuilt on the basis of what is still there. The murals suffered greatly. So this is some of the murals that are survived, but most of them fell down, crashed down. Here you can see that this is the top with these nice kind of figures of esoteric practice. You can see that some of them crashed, but some of them survived. And this is shortly afterwards, the Buddhacharyas in place who kind of salvaged what had fallen off, the bigger pieces. So some pieces, as you can see here, were maintained. And, important to notice that the very first kind of attempts like this involved the Buddhacharyas. I mean, the Buddhacharyas are the traditional guardians of the stupa and of Svayambhu. They don't own it. The owner really is ultimately the king, and if you want to put it this way, it's the government and with the DOA in charge of it. But the Buddhacharyas, are the traditional guardians with special rights, and obviously their voice needs to be heard, and whatever is going to happen with the mural, they need to be on board with that. On the other hand, I also don't think that they should be left to decide things on their own. As I said, the real traditional owner is the population of Kathmandu and the king. So this is shortly afterwards. You can see more fragments here. And then, thanks to the intervention of David and people from the archaeology department, Devendra Bhattarai, UNESCO, as I said, with David Andolfato, and surely also locals helping again. What remained on the walls was peeled off under the guidance of this conservator called Rodolfo Lujan, who's also working at Lomantang, doesn't he, with the paintings? So they were brought, the surviving pieces were brought to the Chauni Museum. This is where I saw them a couple of weeks ago, and this is kind of the cloth with which they will be, they will be glued back to the wall, and then the white cover will be removed and they can be put back in place. So part of the murals can actually, since we have precise photography, can actually be put back in situ. And obviously that's what should happen. These bigger pieces are wonderful, and many of them, particularly the one at the top, predate the renovation of 1904. So the 1904 renovation was really restricted, as far as I can tell, to the narrative registers and possibly to the lower, some of the lower guardian deities, Tantric guardian deities on the southern wall. But many of them, the wonderful Padmanateshwar and so on, are older. So what I would propose to happen is that these surviving pieces are put back in situ once the building has been repaired, and it's being repaired just as it is, so it's the same space. We don't have to kind of decrease or increase scale. And I think whatever has not been, and I don't think it's such a great idea to worry too much about these very small fragments. I mean, this is not, a Greek mosaic that's 2,500 years ago. And these very small little pieces, my own feeling is baigo, matlab dinu padaina. That's kind of my own sense. These pieces of this size, yes, but I'm not an expert. I mean, this is obviously somebody like Rodolfo and David and other people who will be able to tell what should be happening. But my own sense is that one should actually not just try to recreate with the remainders what in a sense will only be a fragment, but one should really try and create a complete thing. I think one should use the photography that is in place, and paint on that basis, faithful to the storyline, which I don't think should be changed. It's never been changed. In 1904, they could have updated the stories. They could have added the Manichuda stories and the other stories. They did not. They always were faithful to the story. So I think that should be preserved. I think the captions should remain in Nevari, which is the language in which they've always been. I don't mind if the language is updated, because that's actually what happened. Some of the Nevari from 1904 in the captions is not the Nevari of Pratap Mala's time. And they've also changed the script. Of course, it was in traditional Neva Lipi originally. Nowadays, it's a Nagari. So that also, I think, is acceptable. And I think that, if you look at we also own to this photography that was taken in 2003. It's actually complete. It's really completely there. It's not difficult to repaint it. And the expertise we have is great in Kathmandu. There's so many wonderful painters who could do this or could do this collectively. So it's really very much doable. This is the main wall, the northern wall. This is the western wall. This is the southern wall. It's basically complete. This is the left side of the southern wall. This is the right side of the southern wall. The only thing that is not complete is the western wall. So this is the western wall as it looked in 1960. These are the photos that Manik, I owe to you, and Takaoka-san. And here's a little bit that survives. So on the western wall, if it's true that the Chitrakar family actually has a complete drawing plan of everything, then it would be easy to use that. Until I've seen it, I regard it as Kimbvadanti, and I'm sort of skeptical. But, I haven't made any efforts in tracing it. We know the family names from the donative inscriptions. We know where the traditional kulche in Kohiti is. So it's certainly possible to, which every effort should be made to see whether they have something and it's actually true. If not, then this place could still be recreated, because the gaps are quite easily identifiable in the text. So suddenly you look at the text and suddenly the painting breaks off, and 20 shlokas further down it restarts again. So the 20 shlokas in between, you basically know what happens, and our artists here are so wonderful. They'll be able to kind of, in the spirit of what survives, the 80% that survives, they'll be able to recreate the 20% that do not survive. So that's, in a sense, what I think would be appropriate to the paintings. It wouldn't be what traditional Western conservation historians would advise. But this is what has happened since the time of Pratap Mala. They were painted over and over again. The townscape was updated, the dresses was updated, the script was updated, the language was updated, the storyline was not changed in the least. And why not continue in the same vein rather than recreate the meager remains of a not so great recreation from 1904? That's kind of basically my pitch. One last word. This is, of course, beautiful Purnima, full moon day. You see Pratappur and Anantapur. They were not originally there. They were definitely built by Pratap Mala. That's why they're called Pratappur, and his wife Anantapur. They're being rebuilt already. So why would we not redo the murals and redo the Shikara temples? If we pay that kind of honor and attention and importance to these Shikara temples, let's do the same with these is close-ups of, let's do the same with these murals, my final slide. They deserve that attention, and they deserve the money that this will cost. The kind of quality painting that I would love to see on these walls does not come for free. Really excellent Newar art has its price, and we should pay that price. And I would actually hope that in addition to outsiders, the Nepalese community will step up to the plate. Recently in the Lumbini Vikas course area, the Newar community here has entirely with its own funds, when I tried to contribute, I was not allowed to, entirely with its own funds built a wonderful Newar temple, the Nepal Vajrayana Mahavihar in Lumbini, all on the basis of Nepalese donations. So I don't see why this cannot also be partially at least something that the Nepalese community supports, not only ideologically but also financially. And just to say this again, from my perspective, there are two principal stakeholders. The Buddhacharyas, because they are the traditional guardians, but they're not the owners. This is different from, the Mahabodha Stupa in Kathmandu, which belongs to, Baha. The owners of the Svayambhu Stupa traditionally are the people of Kathmandu, ultimately the king. The king is no more the king, and it's the government, the democratically elected government, so ultimately it's a DOA, the Department of Archaeology, that in a sense stands for the king. But the Buddhacharyas traditionally had rights. In the historical renovations, each of the 13 rings was sponsored by communities. The uppermost ring belongs to the king. The ring below belongs to the Buddhacharyas. That is meaningful. When there are rituals performed at Svayambhu, the Buddhacharyas are judged mana. They're the patrons of the ritual. They don't pay for that. They're technically ritually the patrons. So they have to be brought on board. The solution has to be found that they themselves agree with. This is not very easy because the Mahasamiti running in charge of Svayambhu is a complex body with many different interests under one roof. But it can be done. It has been done at the 2008-2010 renovation, where the Mahasamiti supported it and was basically doing what it could to lend its support. And I'm sure that it's going to be done again with, if it's done in the right way, including them. And of course, we have the UNESCO here. They've been critical initially in efforts to rescue the murals and lending their support. And they have the expertise, for instance, by bringing in this person called Rodolfo Lujan, who is a world-famous expert in this. So obviously, UNESCO can provide the kind of expertise we need for this. So it's something that I feel very strongly about, and I hope I haven't brought too much by making this case. Let me just say in conclusion, I've never spoken with Dina about what should happen after the restoration. But this is not for me to talk about the late the kind of project she would have been very enthusiastic about. And I think my basic suggestion of using this as an occasion for local artists to actually exercise and display and contribute their expertise, I think she would have very much approved. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Much food for thought and much calories for excitement, particularly because your presentation on Santipur murals comes at a time when the people of Kathmandu Valley are trying to find a voice for preservation, everything from open space to heritage. And there is a need for something that is imaginative, that is also can be done in a public spirit with collaboration of the people. So what you have ended, how you have ended, I think gives us the motivation to move ahead with the restoration in the way that you have suggested, in my view, of the Santipur murals. Also because the people of Kathmandu Valley, Svayambhu is self-originated. and we have self-destructed the valley. And in that sense, I think if there is a way that we can excite the imagination of the people of Kathmandu Valley, as you said, from localized crowdfunding from within Kathmandu Valley, it may be something that will give us much more than the murals back to us, but give us an energy to move on to many other shrines and move on to the tangible and intangible heritage of this valley. So thank you very much for that presentation. We will now have the floor open for about 15 minutes. Questions and answers. Please be brief. There will be a mic coming your way. If you raise your hand, it'll come your way. If I might just quickly ask Alexander one question while you get your act together in the audience. Any action needs a community, and you have suggested that the community has to be beyond the Vajracharyas and beyond the state. But are there communities within Kathmandu town proper? Maybe not Lalitpur, maybe not Khopa, maybe not Bhaktapur, but within Kathmandu town, are there communities and Bahas and Sanghas that feel very, very attached to Svayambhu Stupa and Chaitya, that they may feel that they can take this up? And I think I'll have to ask you to go back up there because the audience has to see you as you answer. So that is my question for you while we wait for.
Does this work?
Yes.
I think there are multiple stakeholders in this, or multiple communities, and I think it's important to have everybody on board, so to speak. So the Buddhacharyas, well, not Vajracharyas, the Buddhacharyas of Svayambhu, they are, as I said, the traditional guardians of the temple, but they're not, to repeat that point, they're not the owners of the temple. And also materially speaking, traditionally, they don't own Zaga. Traditionally, they actually live as pujaris from the offerings and so on. So traditionally, the Buddhacharyas have not provided funds for the renovation of the stupa. The main funder of past renovations have actually been Shakya and Tuladar families. That's the traditional backbone that has supported Svayambhu materially. And the Tibetans, when they were involved, and to some degree the king and the royal government would also chip in. So that is a traditional structure. And actually at the renovation in 2018, it were particularly the Tuladars, Damasau and his family and people of his community who supported this and who were very effective at that time in raising funds upon the Tibetan, because these Tuladars were actually located in Shigatse and Lhasa and had these traditional trading links. Nirmal, you know all about this. So this is one community. But to just add to the point, sorry, I'm taking too much time, sorry. Just briefly, this traditional system of Tuladars and Shakyas supporting this, to which degree that would still be able to work, I do not know. And also nowadays the Newars are actually, in a minority in the valley, and it, from my perspective, would be wonderful if this were something that would not only be identified with by the Newar community, but by the larger Nepalese community.
Thank you. Ramesh Tungel. I just have a query related to Bhutan's connection, because once history shows that it was the whole mound, including the foothills, most of the places in foothills were given to Devadharma, Bhutan, Bhutan lamas, lamas are rulers that time, and the oldest monastery was located there. It is now in ruined condition, demolished during the earthquake. What was the position of Bhutan, and what would be now between Nepal and Bhutan? Because in historical materials we clearly find that it was whole mound, in whole Svayambhunath was given to Deva Dharma under their jurisdiction.
You know more about that part of the history than I do. I just tell you what I gather. What I gather is that the Bhutanese were, in a sense, a kind of Purohit patron-priest relationship with the Gorkhali royalty before Prithvinarayan Shah conquered the valley. And that when the Shahs came and took charge of the valley, because of the link with the Bhutanese, which predates their conquest, they actually gave the Bhutanese special rights. And as you rightly said, the oldest gompa up at Svayambhu is Bhutanese, and the renovation that took place around 1816, actually had the Bhutanese take the lead in this. However, I don't think that these rights of the Bhutanese and that a sense of responsibility would really be strong enough for them now to kind of assume responsibility for this. I also suspect that they don't have a lot of say and power in the Mahasamiti. I don't know exactly how the Mahasamiti is composed, but in addition to Buddhacharyas, it's got a Tamang element, and it might have a representative of the Bhutan monastery up at Kimdol that kind of is ultimately kind of inheriting these rights. But I don't think that the Bhutanese, that the remnants of kind of privilege, adhikar, that the Bhutanese were once given, I don't think that they translate more in the Bhutanese being one of many possible stakeholders.
I wonder, actually I am looking after your... myself is Milan Sakya just, and I'm chairing the Center Department of Buddhist Studies at Tribhuvan University. My attention here is to focus you in the painting, whether it is mural, regarding to the mural and the topic. And this topic, because as you say, Santipur is Agam. And you are relating all these pictures belong to the Purana, Svayambhupurana. I'm looking after all line by line, and I have seen only the Gopusagra Giri, but I have not seen the Svayambhu because my eyesight might be so short. Because if it is Purana, why the Tantra is consecrated? Why it is interrelated? Because these are two traditions from the very beginning. And this beginning belongs to the time, as it has been said. Like the thing sometimes it happens like, sometimes it is mystery, now it is history. So the history, what we have in hand is only the Svayambhupurana, Svayambhupurana, a short Svayambhupurana. Now what we are talking about is all the illustrated, all the historical, they are all the mythological legends, what we find. But in the main shrine is different. Why this? Why is this?
Yeah. I can only say what the situation is. So the situation is, you've got the narrative, which follows the Svayambhupurana faithfully. I've connected this, read the text and looked at the images side by side. It's a very, very faithful rendering of the text. And that is not, as you rightly point out, Tantric. That's one part. And then on top, below the gabled roofs on the north and south, we have, or we used to have, these scenes that are basically creating a space for initiate, higher yogini tantric practices. So they coexist, or coexisted. And the the tantric practice part is in tune with the larger place. This is the entrance to, in many ways, the most sacred tantric shrine of Newa Buddhism, at least of the Kathmandu tradition. By the way, all of the Vajracharyas, all of the boys who take the Acharya Luigu, the Acharya Abhisheka, meet up at Santipur once a year to be confirmed as members of the Vajracharya community of Svayambhu, of Kathmandu. So this is really the kind of half of that tradition. So it's a tantric place, and then it suddenly has these huge, enormously elaborate, probably very expensive paintings in it. We don't know how this happened because we don't have the sources. What I'm suggesting, but it's only a hypothesis and I may be completely wrong, but my own suggestion is, given all of the other stuff that Pratap Mala did up there, and given the attested investment, particularly in Santipur, I find it very plausible that the tradition that we have, at least rendered in one Tyasafu, that tradition is actually true, and it was Pratap Mala who had these paintings made. He will have had the power. If he came and he said, I'm going to have the Svayambhupurana painted there, there would have been no possibility for the Buddhacharya or Vajracharya community of Kathmandu to say, no, Pratap Mala, you can't do that. That definitely would not have been an option. So that's my own theory, but as I said, I cannot answer that question. One thing that came to my mind also when I was contemplating this, that's a different story. Let's the integration of the Avadana into the Purana, that's a textual story, and that's 19th century, and that's a different story. So I prefer to stay with the Santipur.
Can we move to another question over there? And you may confer it later, sir.
I'm Suyog Prajapati from the Central Department of Buddhist Studies. And I'm interested by two of the scenes that I've seen here. One related to the blocking of the water and discovery of Guhyeshwari, and the other related to Gaudpada Acharya, or Prachandadev, who later became Shantikar Acharya. So I have two questions, maybe you can answer clearly. First, regarding Guhyeshwari and one of your earlier papers, you have mentioned a goddess named Khaganana. Is it the same Guhyeshwari, or is it a primeval deity that was present before it was superseded by Svayambhu? And the second question is, what is the relation between Gaudpada Acharya and the Khotanese legend? Like in your earlier papers, you have also mentioned that Svayambhupurana is also kind of related to a Khotanese legend. So what relation is there between Gaudpada Acharya, the king from India, to this Khotanese legend? And the first question was regarding the word Khaganana. Is it a Sanskrit word, native Newari word?
So, Khaganana is, it's a Sanskrit name. It means having a face, anana, of a skygoer, Khaga. So Khaganana is somebody who has a bird face. And she is a goddess who appears in the Chakrasamvara Mandala. And the Chakrasamvara Mandala is definitely one of the traditions that the creators of the Svayambhupurana were very well attuned to. According to the Chakrasamvara Mandala, there are 3 circles of 8 deities, 24 places, and one version distributes them across South Asia, India in the kind of traditional sense, not in the modern sense. And one of these 24 nodes is Himalaya, and that is identified by the Nepalese tradition as saying, that is us, that's Nepal. And that particular node is identified with Khaganana. So she becomes, in a sense, the presiding goddess of Nepal in that tradition. That is a very, in a sense, Sanskritic and, in a sense, very, learned interpretation. The mural painting, they don't go for Khaganana. Nobody knows what Khaganana is, a strange word. So in the mural painting, they only talk about Guhyeshwari. So I've been talking about the fact that the murals are faithful to the text. That's as far as the narrative, the storyline is concerned. not the actual wording. They're also quite, the spelling is pretty, Maitreya becomes Maitri, and sometimes, Vipashyin, who's Vipashvin, becomes Vipashri, and it goes on and on and on. Some of the stuff, Vipashri makes sense, but some of the stuff doesn't really make a lot of sense. So Kaganana is kind of, the more learned version, if you want to put it this way. In these versions, they call her simply Guhyeshwari. As far as your other question is concerned, the link between these Khotanese legends and the Svayambhupurana, this is really Bruff, the wonderful SOAS and Cambridge professor who worked a lot on the Newa tradition. Most of his work is not known. He did a monumental translation of a text called Papa Parimochana that was never published because he died prematurely in an accident. Bruff wrote about this, and I don't really think I can add to what Bruff has said. The only thing I can say is there are a couple of important works that kind of enlarge upon them. One is by Nick Allen, whom, of course, he has this paper, I think in the Festschrift for MacDonald, about Himalayan water drainage myths. And then there's a new monograph by a German scholar called Max Deeg that probes into, that examines Chinese accounts of the history of Nepal. Not Xuanzang and not Faxian, earlier stuff, Wangtse. And he uses that as an occasion to also compare what he calls the foundational myths of Nepal, i.e. the Svayambhu myths, to other myths. For instance, in Kashmir and the Nilamata Purana you have something. But this is, I can only refer you to Nick Allen, to Bruff, to Max Deeg. I don't really have anything to add to that.
Sir, I don't know much about this Buddhist Purana, so I want to ask a simple question. Samrat also came here, made many chaitya here, 2 or 3, one is in Tamil also. That is not renovated yet. But are all these things we read on Puran text, are these somewhat we believe on, or it's a history or real history? I want to say that.
It's an interesting
We have to believe it, or was there existence of Manjusri or not? Was there existence of Krishna or not?
Krishna, let's not go to Krishna. So I don't know, maybe 15 years ago I gave a talk at TU at Tribhuvan University about the Svayambhupurana, and I was asked the same question. And the historians and archaeologists in the room were very upset with me because I didn't clearly state that it was a myth. And my host, Nareshman Bhadracharya, was very disappointed that I didn't affirm the veracity of the myth. Basically what I then said is that it's not my job as a Western academic to verify whether these things are true or not. It's for you guys to make up your mind. I'm studying what you guys wrote and what you painted, but whether it actually reflects truth or does not reflect truth, that you have to decide. I'm sorry, I can't improve upon what I said 15 years ago.
All I can suggest is that the mythology and the geology of Kathmandu Valley coincide in human habitation. So to that extent, we can say mythology is leading geological studies on this. Since there is no question from the floor, I will take the liberty of asking the last question, which is leading toward what the professor was talking about, looking ahead. There are so many conservation architects as well as conservation individuals and community people in the audience. I think the suggestion that you made was a very considered suggestion that we should go for bringing back the murals, but not necessarily in what was done in 1904. And I think that message comes across very clear, and it's up to the community and the stakeholders to decide whether to take up your question, your suggestion or not. My question is, in the murals that are left, the fragments that are left, is it possible to do modern scanning methods, laser, etc., as we read about being done in the Sistine Chapel elsewhere, to see what is in the second layer, so that we would know what is the genre of artwork which was overlaid, or maybe overlaid more than once. If that were possible, we could actually, with confidence, go back to that era when the Pauba and other artists of today try to recreate.
That's a wonderful suggestion. I think it's a really great suggestion. My gut feeling is that these big fragments like the Padmanabheshwar and so on, that they may be very old and there may not be that many layers below, but when it comes to the narrative scenes below, that would be really interesting to do. To be honest, Kanakji, I don't know the answer to that. It's something that David, who's left already, or the UNESCO expert might be in a better position to say, but it would be great to do that before, and it would be great to decide to do this and to have this done before they're put back in place, and it's technically more difficult or even impossible to do so. I think it's a great suggestion.
This particular Nepal and the Himalaya conference, on behalf of the organizers, Deepak Thapa, Rajendra Pradhan, and all other members of the Baha, and on behalf of the audience, may I thank you for this lecture, and may I ask the audience to give him a rousing ovation. Now, floor is open as he joins the floor.